Welcome, everyone, to Just Plain Wrong, the podcast where three Mennonite librarians discuss Amish fiction and depictions of Amish, Mennonite, and other plain groups in pop culture. Today, we are talking about the 1985 film Witness.
Yes.
So, Witness was released in 1985. Aaron was 2 years old, Abby, you were 1, and I was -5 years old. So this actually was my first time seeing the movie. It did quite well, critically speaking. I was nominated for Best Picture and Best Actor, though it lost in those categories. I did, however, win the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay and Best Film Editing. It was directed by Peter Weir, who also did Dead Poet Society, The Truman Show, and many other notable movies. So to summarize the film, spoilers ahead and throughout the rest of the episode, Witness tells the story of the widowed Rachel Lapp, an Amish woman, and her son Samuel, who's, I don't know, maybe 5. I'm bad at telling kid age. And Samuel witnesses a murder while they are having a layover in Philadelphia's 30th Street station. So the Philly detective John Book, who is played by Harrison Ford, is on the case, and he's there to try and make sure that Samuel can ID the killer. Samuel IDs a cop for the crime, and when Book discovers that the corruption goes into the police department, he takes Samuel and Rachel back to Lancaster, getting wounded by a bullet along the way. And because he is hit by a bullet, he has to stay with them to recover. Along the way, he tries to integrate himself into the Amish community with mixed success. He and Rachel have a romantic connection. And then ultimately, the corrupt cops track them down, and there's a fight that goes throughout the farm, and it ends with Book killing 2 of the cops and stopping the third, and then returning to the city to do his job. What other plot points should we mention and scenes should we talk about?
I did think it was interesting when I was looking at the background of this film. I had not realized how absolutely bonkers popular Harrison Ford would have been when he filmed this. Like, this is like post Indiana Jones, like recently after Star Wars. So he would have been at kind of not peak, because I don't want to imply that it's been all downhill since The Witness, but but he would have been like a megawatt star for this. So that was just something kind of interesting for me to realize in terms of the trajectory. And then just also because the last time I viewed this was, I think, in my teens, so like a very long time ago. So to see it again in my 30s, I remember the first time around viewing it in the sense like, oh, Harrison Ford, he's attractive in that kind of like old guy way. And now I look at it and I'm like, Harrison Ford is hot. And he's like a peer. I mean, not quite. I think he's like was in his early 40s when he filmed this. But anyways, so it has nothing to do with plot. That's just some commentary on what I thought of the film, or mostly Harrison Ford.
I'd say that's accurate. Harrison Ford, still attractive. So Witness is maybe the most famous dramatic film about the Amish. It's inspired homage, it's inspired parody. I can think of several scenes that have been inspired by it that I didn't realize until I actually saw the movie. So what scenes from Witness seem to be the most enduring for you, or what stood out the most?
Yeah. So, like Abby, I think I saw this movie for the first and only time prior to this week, maybe somewhere around the age of 12 or 13. And it was really interesting because I had sort of 3 distinct memories about this movie, and 2 of them were totally wrong. So it's just this reminder of how inaccurate our memories are. So I remember the one that I had kind of right in my head is the scene at the very beginning where Samuel witnesses the murder and he at the last second has to duck under the stall. That one was etched in my brain and I had remembered that scene correctly. And the other 2, one was the silo scene where the bad guy at the end is sort of suffocated under this corn, which is horrific. But in my memory, it was a corn crib and it was actually Harrison Ford that was in the thing and he managed to get out. So I guess in my brain, I couldn't handle the death. So I made it a positive memory that Harrison Ford escaped. That is not what happened. It was just as horrifying to watch this time around. And then I also, probably because I was 12 or 13 when I watched it, I remembered these sort of like sexy scenes. But if you had asked me, I would have I thought there was like implied sex, but turns out there isn't. They just have some sort of awkward kissing in a field at one point. And I have this like memory of her like untying her bonnet. That also did not happen. So I think the silo and the sort of sexual tension are things I remembered, but very inaccurately.
Yeah, I very similar in terms of the scenes that I remembered, but also kind of I mishmashed them in my head in kind of similar ways. The only other kind of one that was amusing to me, even after watching For Richer or Poor, I had in my head attached the ending of that to this movie. So I thought there was going to be at the end some awkward scene where everyone like turns their back on Harrison Ford in some kind of odd shunning of an outsider. Fortunately, they didn't go that direction. So yeah, I think the other thing, and this is definitely, just again, my own eyes of being significantly older this time, was just how really beautiful this film was. I can see why it won the awards that it won. I felt like the cinematography from the beginning was really neat. I liked how it did some interesting things with kind of playing with having like a child's perspective, like the scene when Samuel's kind of wandering around the station and looking up at things. And anyways, I just really felt like it had a lot of beauty to it. And as someone who did, grew up I spent the first 10 years of my life in Lancaster County. So it felt like it depicted, some of the beauty of that area. So that was definitely, I think, something that stuck out to me.
Yeah. I'm not entirely sure what my expectations were going into the movie, but I didn't quite expect it to be so beautiful, mainly because we had just watched For Richer or For Poor, and that movie was not beautiful.
No.
So one of the things that I thought was particularly notable is how the Amish stance against violence was continually talked about in the film, but it didn't seem like it changed anyone's behavior throughout the film. So there's the scene where Eli Lapp is telling his grandson Samuel, who's, only a few days out from having witnessed this horrible knifing in a bathroom in Philadelphia. And he has found John Book's handgun, and Eli wants to make sure that he knows what this handgun is for. And he says, "The gun of the hand is for the taking of human life. We believe it is wrong to take a life that is only for God. Many times wars have come and people have said to us, you must fight, you must kill. It is the only way to preserve the good. But Samuel, there is never only one way." And Samuel's fairly conflicted. He's seen violence now, and he says, well, we could just kill the bad men. And Eli says, we can't really identify who bad men are by sight. And furthermore, if we start acting in a violent way, then we become part of the violence, and we can't be separated from it. So the only way to deal with violence is to be as far from it as possible. So it's a surprisingly nuanced moment for a film where several people get shot. But it got me thinking, did this wisdom from Eli actually ever make a difference in Book's perspective, Harrison Ford's character's perspective? You see him coming to appreciate the Amish way of life, but there's still this line that he doesn't seem to be able to cross.
So I guess I'd like to start by seconding how remarkable it is that they even included this, because I feel like all the other media that we've looked at, if it's mentioned this sort of nonviolent component of Amish faith, it's been at a very surface level, like, oh, by the way, we're pacifists, and that's it. So that this movie actually kind of at least tried to wrestle with that and how it might play out in a modern context, I thought was a plus. How it played out and whether there was a moral to it, I'm not sure. It strikes me as interesting that the conversation they depicted was not between Eli and the outsider. It was between Eli and the grandson, who theoretically would have already been somewhat familiar with this. So we see education within the culture. We don't see them really trying to educate John Book, this outsider, about what the Amish stance on this would be. And I mean, I think they hide his gun, but they don't really talk to him about it beyond that. And we see that play out later when there's this pivotal and one of the most famous scenes in the movie when these tourists are acting very rude and they get in the faces of the Amish people. And John Book is getting very angry, and Eli says, "Please don't, it's not our way." And John Book responds with, "But it's my way." And I love that line. It's totally badass. But it sort of strikes me that at that moment, it would have maybe been nice if they had had this conversation about what the Amish values of nonviolence are. So in some ways, I felt like the moral of the film was more that there's this Amish way of life, and then there's this English or other people's way of life that relies on violence. And I don't know that it really puts a value judgment on either of those. We see at the end of the movie, John Book kills people that are bad, and we find ourselves rooting for him because they're bad people. But then at the very, very end, the last scene, we have the last bad guy standing. He's got his gun, and the Amish all appear, and they're standing there being very nonviolent. And I'm assuming it's a callback to the title of the movie, that they're standing there like literally witnessing this, and it causes the bad guy to put down his gun. So we have nonviolence working, but we also sort of saw the violent way working. So I guess I don't know if there's how to interpret it all, but I found it really interesting, and I'm very curious to hear what you have to say on this.
A lot of similar thoughts. I felt like this had engaged with this idea on a much deeper level than a lot of other stuff that we have looked at. One line that I thought was really interesting at the end of Samuel and Eli's conversation that I thought was really poignant was, so after they've had this back and forth and Eli has pointed out that you don't know what they're doing in their hearts, Samuel, this little traumatized boy who is literally, he has seen someone get killed right in front of him. He was, saw things in the city that he would have never seen. And then he also has been around this like gravely injured man who he also probably views slightly heroically. So he responds, "I can see what they do. I have seen it." So I just think that's really interesting because it feels like he's making the case that, that nonviolence will only take you so far to a certain extent. Like, obviously he's probably, at least from the child perspective, is coming from a place of trauma and wanting the safety of something that will stop the bad men. And in many ways, that's what the movie gives us. It gives us this hero with a gun, or at least a hero with a silo and a gun, and to stop the bad people. I agree, like the ending where they all kind of gather around is a really neat moment, but it's also very clear that it feels very much like that was the movie views that as a partial solution. So I think in many ways it still deals with this idea and very typical for Hollywood, where they say, "Oh, that's an interesting and nice perspective. It's nice for you, but we can't really do that as a society." That we still need our good guys with the guns. We still need our good cops. We need them to keep us safe. And we do, it's those people keeping you safe that lets you have the freedom to, ignore guns. So I think it kind of comes back around to a very typical place where Hollywood doesn't very frequently engage with the deeper ideas of what nonviolence resistance can truly be. But I did find it, fascinating. And I also really enjoyed that conversation with Eli and Samuel.
I think you're right. I think that when it comes down to it, the movie is saying that not that this way of life is bad, but that it's not going to work for everyone. You see John Book doesn't stick around. He doesn't move to the country and settle down and become Amish. He goes back to the city, and maybe he'll have been rejuvenated by his time in the country, and maybe he will have a greater awareness of the repercussions of violence, but that doesn't mean he's going to stop using it as a tool, which is you know, speaking from a Mennonite perspective, a little disappointing. I would like a cop who goes back and interrogates the power structure that he is a part of and confronts his own internalized racist issues, of which he clearly has many, because the way that this film treats Black people is very disposable.
Yeah. It definitely, and I will say that is a part of the opening is definitely a part that maybe did not age as well. The whole idea that as a good cop, basically Book just drags Rachel and Sam to the nearest predominantly Black bar and just starts like showing them random Black men that he thinks might have committed this. Oof, that did not age well.
Yeah.
Like
He literally throws one up against the car window. Yeah.
I know. I was like, okay.
I don't think a single Black person lived to the end of the movie, even the good ones, like his partner. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And he never filled his partner in on much. He pretty much just said, take care of the files and stay safe. By the way, I'm noping off to Lancaster County to hang out with a kid and his sexy mom. So take care of yourself. That was frustrating. I thought his partner deserved to be in on it more.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of romancing recent widows, how plausible did you guys find the relationship between Rachel and John? The chemistry seemed a little forced, and I have a hard time believing that any straight woman could not have chemistry with Harrison Ford because Harrison Ford. But there was something about it where I just thought that even with the idea of a confused Rachel, you know, looking to find release outside of her community, looking to leave her home behind in rebelling in that way, it just didn't quite make sense to me that they would be a romance. What did you think?
I also had a lot of questions here. I think I bought into their physical attraction in terms of chemistry a little bit more. The reason for Book's potential attraction seems kind of, well, of course, you know, there's a sexy widow lady and you're out in the country and, you know, why not have a little shindig or whatever. But Rachel's motivations are she's very opaque. They tell us very, very little about her. We don't know we don't even know this, you know, we don't know the circumstances of her husband's death. We don't know, you know, maybe he had been sick for years. Maybe he died suddenly. We don't know. We know very little. And while I feel like the Amish widow clearly enjoys looking at Harrison Ford, which I did like seeing that. You know, I think that is anytime you kind of can flip the script a little bit in the way that we view men's and women's bodies and things like that, I think can be an interesting thing to see. But I wanted to know more about what was going on with Rachel, what was going, you know, there was clearly things like you could tell, and I feel like the acting was good enough that you could kind of tell that there were things going on, but the movie left no, you know, it wasn't her story. She was still an object. She was still this thing to be won, this thing to be courted. But yeah, no actual idea about why she would, you know, kind of play with something that in many ways, not dangerous in the sense of, you know, presenting a physical threat, but dangerous in the sense that it could really, you know, damage her ability to maintain her role within a much more restrictive culture. And you don't mess with that if you don't have strong rationale to do so. And especially to have it be so much that she very clearly approaches him. You know, it is not, while he flirts with her and dances with her and stares at her, she initiates with him very clearly. So yeah, I was fascinated. I wanted to know more about what was going on with her. That's how I ended up.
Yeah, I agree. Like, for being one of the primary characters, she really didn't have a lot to say, and we certainly didn't get to know a whole lot about her emotional state. Like to have just lost your husband, presumably tragically, because she's young and so is her son. And to then like within the span of like merely days to also have this murder thing occur and the stranger get shot and be in your house. And now all of a sudden you're like thinking sexy thoughts. And that's not to say it couldn't happen, but it just feels very unlikely, and even more unlikely in the context of an Amish culture, which would have presumably, I feel like one of maybe the inaccuracies in this movie is that like you see it in the funeral scenes, like she's surrounded by people constantly. And I feel like that would have continued once she got back home. But instead, we just see the doctor and then some threats about the bishop. We don't ever see people coming over, which I feel like both because she was a widow and that they had this injured stranger in their home would have necessitated a lot more community involvement. On the other hand, like both of you have already said, 1985 Harrison Ford would have been very hard to resist. He's a very good looking man, and it's he's hot a lot. Like it must have been summer. So he's constantly got his shirt like half unbuttoned, and it's a look for Harrison Ford 1985. Yeah, I didn't really know what to make of it all. I found it unbelievable, both because of the cultural differences and because of the trauma that this poor woman would have gone through. But I agree with what you said, Abby. Like, it would have just been really nice to know what she was thinking. And we just never really get to find that.
Yeah, it's interesting how we know her opinions, but we don't know her motivations. She's very clear when she first meets Book, I don't want to know anything about you. I just want to get to my sister's house. We don't want to have any part in this investigation. I'm not interested in working with the police. I'm not interested in you whacking people. She accuses him of whacking people, and he does. It's some police violence issues there. I don't want your gun in this house. Once you are in this house, you're going to be following our rules. You're not going to be doing whatever you want. So she's very firm about a lot of things, which I sort of appreciate that they allow her to draw those boundaries and to be so matter of fact about it. But it seems like there's this conflict there where she's telling him very loudly, your culture is not my culture. There's a barrier here. And then despite that cultural divide, she still is sort of interested in taking up with him. I guess there's a point to be made maybe too about how attraction is not always convenient.
True.
And Harrison Ford, I mean, maybe he can cause you to throw your entire cultural and belief system out the window. 1985 Harrison Ford.
All it takes is some buttons unbuttoned and to know your way around a barn raising and to drink some lemonade in a very provocative manner. I think we should talk about the barn raising.
It was so long, that scene.
And why it was included.
Yeah.
For something that didn't have any relevance to the plot.
I will say, did you know that Harrison Ford was a carpenter?
I totally looked that up too.
Yes. So maybe they just had the whole barn raising scene so that Harrison Ford could show off his mad carpentry skills. Who knows?
I assumed it was because, so just like we had that scene in For Richer for Poorer where Tim Allen finally earns the respect of the men by like training the horse or something. I sort of assumed it was like that. So like he climbs up there and they see him working hard. And I guess all it takes for the Amish to like you is to be seen as a hard worker. And it also allowed all the other people to gossip about how they had stolen glances at each other.
A lot of the movie depicted this as a very idyllic situation, that Amish, live this peaceful, perfect life. And barn raising is a great way to emphasize that. True. Oh, look, all these people coming together and working so hard and creating this thing in just one day. So I think, I can see why they wanted to take the time, they wanted to put it in there. I also don't know quite why it was so long, and I do have to, did want to point out, I did quite enjoy the short appearance of Viggo Mortensen, or as I know him, Aragorn, my one true love.
He was a brother of the secondary love interest for Rachel, according to the IMDb credits.
Okay,
I didn't know. Also one of the Hawk Leichners. On my Wikipedia reading, it turns out that the director actually hired him because he thought that Viggo Mortensen looked Amish, which I thought was
What?
hilarious because I think he looks very not Amish.
Anyway, back to the barn raising.
I felt sure that it was going to be leading up to some sort of callback, that it was John Book realizing how much he needs a community, because we got this line earlier from via his sister that he needs to find somebody. He needs to not be alone. You know, he needs to get married and have kids and have more friends and have a life. And that this was going to be the thing that taught him that he needed those things. And you see him sharing this glass of lemonade with his supposedly romantic rival, and that they're coming to respect each other, and that there's no violence or posturing between John Book and Daniel Hockliner. And I thought, okay, well, maybe they'll call back to this at the end. You know, maybe they'll end up together. Maybe they'll be a carpenter or something. But it wasn't. That I was so sure that this was going to be bookending something.
Nope.
But it wasn't. It was just sort of like, I don't know, like pastoral porn. Like it felt almost gratuitous.
Pastoral porn.
In a way. Yeah, like look at how good these people are. And they got some of the mechanics of it right. You know, like they got the men sitting down to eat and the women serving them so that the men can go back to work and then the women will eat. You know, they got that, you know, some of the mechanics of the barn raising right, even though the singing at the end was not right. So, you know, like and it's a cool thing. Barn raisings are cool. But it really need to be there. I just don't think it did. All right. Well, let's move on to the next question. And this is a pretty broad one related to the Amish response to this film, which was not positive. In part, this was because films in general are sort of offensive to the Amish. John A. Hostetler, who is one of the most noted scholars, students of Amish way of life, talks about how there are individual inaccuracies in the film. Things like the actors use High German instead of Pennsylvania Dutch, or they're singing at the barn raising, or some of the hairstyle and grooming patterns just don't quite work, among many other things. But that the actual filming of Witness interfered in daily life because they filmed in Lancaster and they infringed on the downtown. They didn't film on any Amish farms, and they couldn't actually get anyone to be an Amish advisor because no Amish person was willing to work on the film. But the whole presence of the movie it's fiction. It presents a lie. It's a Hollywood film, so it promotes pride. It displays violence and even viewing violence, as we know from the discussion between Eli and Samuel. Even viewing violence brings you closer to violence. It takes something that should be private and separate and makes it known. A group of Amish bishops actually met with the lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania, and the governor himself eventually came to an agreement that the state would no longer promote the Amish as a subject of film, and that it would prevent the state from working with any film companies who filmed the Amish without consent. And Hostetler claims that any filming of the Amish for dramatic terms or for documentary terms is sort of inherently voyeuristic and inherently invasive. And in modern terms, I would say this is cultural appropriation. So what are your thoughts? Is this cultural appropriation? And if it is, do the benefits of showcasing the Amish way of life with dignity outweigh the infringement on Amish life?
I was thinking about this, and for whatever reason, I didn't feel like this was necessarily full-on cultural appropriation, but I don't know if that's in some ways just because I am both close and not close to the subject matter. Like, I have connection to Lancaster. I'm Mennonite. So maybe there's part of me that's trying to kind of make it okay because of my own personal connection to it to a certain extent. Although, I mean, obviously it had nothing to do with the movie. Yeah, I can definitely see that this would not be appreciated by the Amish. And I can see that having issues. Yeah, I went back and forth, and I honestly didn't have a really solid answer. I think a lot of it does come back to consent in terms of, and depicting these communities. I also kind of wonder, this was filmed, wow, yeah, 30 years ago, and how, given where the Amish are now, would that necessarily, how would they view that? There definitely have been way more invasive and way more culturally inappropriate depictions of the Amish than this film, but maybe none that made such a big impact. It was interesting. I will say I watched this movie with my parents. Both of my parents would have grown up conservative Mennonite, and I think my dad's grandfather would have been Amish. So there would have been some connection there. And I think I remember my dad saying at one point that he would have had interest in knowing what his dad thought of this movie, but obviously his dad would not have watched it. So anyways, that's kind of a long and rambly thing. Honestly, I don't entirely know whether this would really be cultural appropriation, but I think it's a good question to be asking.
I agree. To build on what Abby was saying there, I also found it interesting to consider, would they be offended by this now? And in particular, just sort of in contrasting it to what we know about Amish and how they perceive all of these romance novels that are out about them. And we've mentioned the book Thrill of the Chase a few times on this podcast already. And she talks about this at some length. But yeah, basically, it seems like Amish aren't particularly bothered by the romance novels. And I don't know if that's because it's a different medium, so they're not having film cameras potentially intrude on their lives, and it doesn't necessarily bring more tourists directly to a particular community, or if it's just that in 30 plus years their views on how they're perceived by the English or by popular culture have just sort of evolved to be like, oh well, we don't really understand why they are interested in us, but whatever. I do think that they were done wrong by the state of Pennsylvania. It sounds like Pennsylvania was like, ooh, a money-making opportunity, and then we can have tourism money on top of it. And they didn't really consider the subjects, like Abby was saying. A lot of it, I think, goes back to consent. Like, how would this have looked if they had talked to the Amish about this movie? I did in one of the articles I read on it, it sounds like the Amish like threatened to leave in one of their conversations with Pennsylvania. Like if Pennsylvania ever did this again, they were ready to like move out of the state, which I thought was kind of fascinating. I also, just the different interpretations of what they were upset about is kind of interesting too. So like Tilly had some articles from John Hostetler. I checked The Riddle of Amish Culture, which is a great book by Donald Crable. And in that, he only talks about it for a couple of pages, but he pinpoints the scene that we've mentioned a few times where Harrison Ford, dressed as an Amish man, punches someone, as one that the Amish were particularly upset about because he was dressed Amish, and therefore, like, to be dressed in a certain way that people would perceive you as Amish and then to behave in that way was particularly upsetting to them. So yeah, I think it's a really complicated question, but certainly the state could have handled things better.
Yeah, I like your point about the changing views. I think, I've been to some of the Amish and older Mennonite tourist spots, where you have bakeries, and in some ways these things showcase Amish life. Amish people are very aware that they are a tourist attraction, and many of them earn a living by being a tourist attraction. And that you can go to an Amish bakery and see a rack of bonnet novels by the cashier, but you won't necessarily see DVDs of Witness hanging out there. And I think some of that is definitely medium. I think in part bonnet novels tend to be more sedate and more chaste. They're less likely to contain instances of violence or sex, but ultimately it is still non-Amish people depicting Amish. And in a lot of today's rhetoric about cultural appropriation, you'd say, let people tell their own stories. But the thing about the Amish is they will not tell their own stories. Or if they do, it's in the form of, a memoir, and you can read it, but they're not designed to be stories that are promoted. So when you have a group that doesn't present itself, that inherently will not present itself to the world outside of instances of their choosing, in their businesses and in their books and their own newspapers. The interest in the Amish is not going to go away. People are always going to be fascinated. So the task of interpreting Amish culture to non-Amish people has to be done somehow. And I think it's going to be done. Sometimes it's going to be done very badly. We have seen the books come into the library that do a terrible job of this, and we have seen books that do a better job. And ultimately, I think Witness kind of falls in the middle. I thought, for the most part, the Amish characters had agency. They had beliefs. They conveyed their beliefs. They weren't infantilized. Things weren't always particularly accurate, but some of the books we've read that were technically accurate, but sort of felt wrong. I felt like this movie actually felt right, but had some technical inaccuracies.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about just any other odds and ends?
I need to talk about Daniel for a minute.
Okay, you do.
So
Sure.
Daniel was the love interest, which, first of all, just like her romance with Harrison Ford, I did not fully understand this very forced feeling budding romance with Daniel, who just did not look Amish even a little bit. He was far too tall. He had weird long hair that just wasn't right. He just didn't look Amish at all, to the point where in my notes, I literally jotted down, this guy looks like he should be a villain in Die Hard. And then lo and behold, I checked his Wikipedia page and he was. This actor was literally a villain in Die Hard. So that's what he looked like. So I found, I don't know, just to approach a woman at her husband's funeral, like with a clear intention of wanting to court her, bothered me. And then the whole actor thing was really funny too.
I do just want to quickly add, I did come up with a theory that explains Daniel and also some issues with Rachel. And I forgot to share this earlier. So my theory is that her husband has been sick for years. So explains why does she have one child? Only one child? She's not using birth control.
And Tilly guessed 5. I was going to put him more as like 8.
Yeah. So we're like one child. So I think her husband has been sick for like 5 years, which explains why at the funeral, Daniel is like waiting with bated breath. He's like, all right, this guy's finally out of the picture. Let's get it on. And also maybe explains why she's a little done too. Like maybe she's been a caregiver of a sick spouse for 5 years or something and is just kind of done. I don't know. That's my theory that might explain at least a little bit why Daniel is so ready to like get that Rachel train going, and why Rachel is also a little bit like really ready for a break.
Harrison Ford being the break.
Harrison Ford. Yeah, that's by a break I meant kissing Harrison Ford.
Yeah, I like that headcanon. I'm gonna adopt that. The thing that I have to talk about is the farm accuracy. For the most part, the depictions of the farm seemed pretty realistic to me. I did think it was odd that they were using the silos. Silos are frequently out of use these days. Structurally, they're not as convenient as other forms of grain storage. So the fact that they were on a barn with a silo that they said had corn in it sort of confused me. But, when Samuel, this little kid, is taking book around the farm, that rang true with me. I can't remember how many people we had over onto the farm, and I'd immediately, you'd show them where the cat had her kittens, and then you'd go into the grain bin and you'd yell so that you could hear the echo, and you'd go climb on a roof and look out over a field so that you could say that you had done it. It was very much like the farm pride, like, here's my kitten, and here's my grain bin, and here's my barn, and here's the cow. I thought rang very true, but what does not ring true is the way that the corrupt cop dies in the silo. Because silos don't store grain at the top. They're like a glass of water. So you you access them from the top opening, and you pour the grain in and it fills up from the bottom, and then when it's time to empty it, you empty it from the bottom. So the fact that they had built in this trapdoor storage room where they had put the grain up there, and I don't even know how they got the grain up there, because pretty much all the tools that I can think of to actually use a silo involve mechanical power of some sort. I just can't see an Amish family harvesting and storing grain that way. It doesn't seem like it would be practical in the slightest. And it would require active modifications of a space that's not very useful. So I got why Harrison Ford was hiding in the grain silo, why he climbs up the ladder and sort of hides in the darkness. But as soon as that trapdoor opened and all this grain started coming down on this man who I suddenly feel very sorry for, because suffocation via corn is a bad way to go. And it is possible. It's just not possible in this specific way. And I called my father to confirm this. I was like, have you ever seen a grain bin that's been set up this way? And he said, no, it doesn't make any sense. And he knew I was talking about witness. And he's like, it made me angry. And they didn't hire a farm expert. And so if you have ever seen this truly horrifying scene in Witness and thought, I will never go to a farm and I will never step in a silo, rest assured, you cannot die in that particular way.
That particular way.
There are other ways you could die.
The manure smells might kill you, but
all right. Well, let's talk ratings. Abby, what do you give this?
Well, we have often kind of divided this into accuracy versus enjoyment. And in terms of enjoyment, I would give this a 5 out of 5. I'm in my mid-30s and I honestly did not watch the first part because I knew that someone was going to die and I hate surprise violent deaths. So I literally went to another room during that scene. Aww. So because I'm a wimp when it comes to violence. But I really enjoyed the movie. It was fascinating. It was I thought overall really well done. Like I said earlier, I thought it was beautifully shot, and I enjoyed watching Harrison Ford do his thing. So yeah, 5 out of 5 for that. Accuracy, they got some things right that other stuff really tends to miss. I enjoyed the conversation, or at least the mention of pacifism or the discussion around it. But yeah, they definitely got other things wrong. And they still played with that trope of kind of the Amish as the naive, can't really make it in the real world kind of thing. So I think I'd give it maybe a 3.5 out of 5 for accuracy.
Yeah, I think my ratings would be very similar. It's hard to not give it 5 out of 5 for entertainment, because I'm pretty sure this will be the best thing that we ever get to watch or read for this podcast. And maybe I will be surprised, but I'm not a person who sits down and watches movies. Some people are missing movies during COVID. I'm not one of them. I couldn't even tell you the last time I've been to a movie theater. I tend to gravitate towards short TV shows or YouTube channels. So to sit down and watch a movie at all is often something I dread. And in fact, I did wait to watch Witness until yesterday morning. But once I started it, I sat there and watched the whole thing, which for me makes it a 5 out of 5 if I don't get bored 10 minutes in and decide I need to do something else or do 5 things while I'm watching it. So yeah, and some of the things we talked about earlier, I thought it was a beautifully directed film, and they did some cool playing with the contrast between violence and pastoral life. Yeah, and I'd probably agree on the accuracy rating too. I thought it did overall okay. Missed some things, but not anything more egregious than we've seen before. So yeah, I'll just copy Abby and do her ratings.
I'm falling in line. I think maybe an enjoyment, it gets probably maybe more of a 4 out of 5 or 4.5. I enjoyed in particular the way that the characters, even if their motivations weren't always explored, at least had personalities. I think there's a tendency in these kind of films to, especially with Amish women, make them sort of a blank slate to project, naive beauty on. And I liked that Rachel did things like laugh, and laugh at people. She laughs at John Book when he turns up in plain clothes for the first time, and she just cracks up. And I thought, yeah, that seems about right. And I liked that I was confused by her decision to initiate making out with John Book, but I appreciated that she initiated it. I appreciated that, Eli had some of his own agendas, and even Samuel had actions that made a difference, which you don't often see in children, in movies or books. So I found that all very satisfying. I think probably 3.5 for accuracy. I think it got a lot of the moods right. I think it got enough of the basics right that the things that it got wrong weren't particularly jarring, at least not to me. To someone more familiar with Amish life, probably I think it would stand out more, but they seemed more within the realm of like normal Hollywood mistakes. Yeah, I suspect this is definitely going to be one of the more critically praised things we review on this podcast.
I don't know. Vanilla Ice Goes Amish might end up being, amazing.
It could. I hear it was surprisingly respectful, and I heard this secondhand from my coworker who worked with a former Amish woman who said it was surprisingly respectful. So we have that to look forward to.
Before we sign off, it should be noted that we maybe were a little too effusive in our praise of this movie, in part because we filmed it not long after watching For Richer or Poorer, but we don't mean to dismiss the movie's mistreatment of its Black characters. We're also fairly aware that many of the things that we review on this podcast do not actually have people of color in them, and so that the maltreatment of people of color in this particular movie is all the more disappointing and frustrating. We also realized that we did not take the time to discuss the shirtless bathing scene in which our female lead toplessly stares at Harrison Ford and he stares back at her, and then they go on their merry way the next day. And we also did not really take the time to discuss that there is a scene with dancing where Book is fixing his car in a barn and the radio comes on and he insists that they must dance. So we are aware of these things and their weirdness to the plot. We just got carried away with other topics. Well, that's it for today's episode. If you have comments, questions, or concerns, you want to share your own plain experiences or Mennonite moments of the week, you can email us at plainwrongpod@gmail.com. You can also interact with us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook under the handle plainwrongpod. In the next few weeks, we're hoping to do another Q&A episode and also feature some listener stories. So if you have any of those, please send them our way. Thanks for listening.